Thank you all for joining us. This is Erin with Idaho Nonprofit Center. We are going to go ahead and get started. Just once again, a few housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded and we will send this out to all of you in attendance, so just be aware of that. Also, we will have time at the end for question and answer. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type those into the question function and we will address questions at the end. All of you will be muted throughout the presentation. However, again, at the end, if you wish to ask your question verbally, raise your hand electronically and I will unmute you to ask that question. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over in just a couple minutes and introduce to you our two presenters. We have Jason Mao, who is an attorney at Greener, Berg, Shoemaker, and Obrecht. He's also a board member for the Idaho Nonprofit Center, so thank you so much for being here, Jason.
Thank you.
And we also have Karen Baerlocher, who is from Peak View Performance Solutions, LLC. And Karen is a business affiliate of the Idaho Nonprofit Center and an HR professional and expert. So thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate this, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you guys.
All right. Thank you. On behalf of Karen and myself, just thank you and Idaho Nonprofit Center for letting us share this very timely topic with you all today. We will go over, we have, of course, there's a new rules that the FLSA just that put out that will be going into effect later this year, and we want to go over introduction to those. I just want to say up front that this is really just an introduction to those rules and some tools for you to work with the new rules that are be taking place later this year, December 1st. This isn't meant to be any legal advice today. There are, of course, every organization is different, so also, you know, different circumstances apply differently to everybody. So hopefully we'll be able to give you all some tools today to work through these issues.
Just one minute. I just had someone type in that they could not hear. If you can hear me, please electronically raise your hand.
Sorry, it sounded like they were mowing outside. Maybe that had something to do with that.
Okay, so it does look like we have people that are hearing us just fine. So if you're having problems with your vocal or your auditory, maybe just try hitting unmute, or it could be maybe the volume. I'm sorry about that if there's issues.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and I will just, we can go to the next slide here and we'll give you a brief overview and then we'll talk a little more about the rule. The Fair Labor Standards Act is the statute at issue here. This is the federal law that has to do with setting standards, as you see here on the slide. It sets standards for 5 main things: minimum wage, overtime, hours worked, record keeping, child labor. But the main ones, of course, are minimum wage and overtime. And of course, today we're talking mostly about overtime. The FLSA is enforced by the Department of Labor and their wage and hour division. They do have a very good website. At the end, we have some contact information for both myself and Karen. Feel free to get hold of us, email us afterwards to get links to these websites, and there's a couple packets regarding the rule as well that we can send along. But the Fair Labor Standard Act, the FLSA, and the Department of Labor, they will do investigations, of course, and there's sanctions for not meeting these standards for minimum wage overtime. They're also, under the FLSA, there's also a private cause of action. So really, it may only take one disgruntled employee to get you in trouble or to raise concerns with the Department of Labor. And there's also a collective action that's available where it may not be just one employee, where one employee can drag in other employees, similarly situated employees, to make more of kind of a class action. So, and any of those actions, there's also the risk of what they call liquidated damages under the FLSA, which is really to say whatever is owed, like if you owe overtime that wasn't paid, or didn't meet the minimum wage standards, whatever amount that is owed to the employee, they would be able to double that amount and recover that under such an action. And under any of those actions, attorney fees are recoverable as well. So the next slide, of course, like we say, the overtime is what we're mostly concerned about, and then what the rules have to deal with. On the first question, of course, always is, does the FLSA apply to my organization? Basically, there's two ways that a organization applies and their employees, and either enterprise, what they call enterprise-wide under the FLSA, or individual, so just applies to the individual employee themselves. And I'll talk about those two. But there are then, of course, just as a rule, organizations like hospitals and schools, care centers, or any organization that teaches, and government agencies, they are all apply under the FLSA automatically, as well do domestic service workers like your housekeepers or gardeners. But on an enterprise-wide test, that has to deal with all the enterprises that are organizations that are large enough that they have at least $500,000 worth of annual volume of business in a year. Now, for nonprofits, that does not apply to any charitable activities or even donations. So this would be any of your kind of your sales, your business sales. I think the easiest example would be if you run a thrift store as part of your organization, part of your services. The business income that you would get for that would count towards this annual amount. Now, this $500,000, it's for all enterprises large enough, $500,000, and that they move in interstate commerce. And so you either have employees engaged in interstate commerce, you produce goods for interstate commerce, or you handle and sell goods that are moved in interstate commerce. And so that means outside of Idaho. You're bringing in goods from Idaho, you're selling goods outside of Idaho, you even down to the point where you're ordering items over online or from another state, or you're taking phone calls, sending out mail to other states, even taking credit card transactions is part of interstate commerce, so beware of that. Now, the next, so you have the enterprise, and then you have the individual rules. So there's, under the FLSA, it could apply to all your employees because you're enterprise-wide, that test there, or one of your individuals inside of your organization may apply. And I think this would probably apply to most, this could apply to most nonprofits. You may not have a large budget, but you do have an individual that is working in interstate commerce. It's making phone calls or dealing with a website, or taking, like I said, the credit card transactions, things like that. So you would be liable for that individual under the FLSA. So you would have to meet the standards for overtime and minimum wage and such. And so that gives obviously who applies under the FLSA. And of course, many of you may be aware that there are exemptions to the overtime and minimum wage laws, and those are generally called exemptions. The white-collar exemptions, the main ones that most people know about for executive, administrative, or professional exemptions. And that has to do with, first of all, they have to be paid on a salary basis, and then there's what they call a duties test, where it's based on these individuals' principal or main or most important duty that they do for your organization. And so like an executive, they customarily and regularly direct the work of at least 2 employees. Or your administrative is someone that does office or non-manual work that's directly related to your business, to management. And they have discretion and independence on matters of significance within your organization. So it's not just a file clerk, but someone with some discretion. And then, of course, professional is someone with advanced knowledge in a field of learning, usually prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction in their background. And so these people would apply. You could pay them on a salary basis, and the exemption would apply to them to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The standards under that wouldn't apply to them. And so that brings us to the new rules. We'll go to this next slide, and Karen will explain to you these new rules.
So the new rules will go into effect in December. December 1st is the effective date for these. It was signed in, the new rules were accepted by the Department of Labor and signed on May 18th, so it is a fairly new rule, and there's a lot of questions. The main change is that the exemption salary requirement went from $23,660 up to $47,476. That's probably the biggest change. There was no change to the duties tests that Jason was just telling us about with the professional, technical, administrative, the duties test that you can do for that exemption. There was no changes to the duties test. It was just changes as far as the salary requirements. Also for highly compensated employees, it went from $100,000 up to $134,004. And they also changed so that the quarterly bonuses and commissions can count towards 10% of that. So that's new. It wasn't, you couldn't account for your non-discretionary bonuses, incentive pays, and commissions prior to this, but now with the new rules you can actually take that into consideration up to 10% of the standard salary threshold. And again, previously there was no regulatory provisions for that. And again, these new rules take into effect December 1st, 2016, and then there'll be increases every 3 years after that. So in January 1st of 2020, there'll be another increase that will jump it up as well. So
to recap, we kind of, we're going to, here after this slide, but we'll stay here, we're going to kind of recap for you, and then we can come up with some kind of steps for you, some things to think over as you work through your budgets and look kind of at your policies and your employees and see where you're at as an organization. But of course you got to determine if the FLSA really applies to you or to your individual employees. And then of course this says that there's no exceptions for nonprofits. So as part of the rulemaking, that was maybe one of the ideas that was put forward to the Department of Labor as they took requests from the public of when they first started talking about this new rule. Would they make an exception for nonprofits? In the end, they have not, or they will not. It's going to apply to nonprofits just as it is to for-profit organizations. So this enterprise or individual test, you'll have to kind of work through that. Does it apply to us as an enterprise, or does it apply to my individual employees? If so, then these kind of areas of HR issues may have to look into. And so this would be very informative, I hope. And so once you do, if you do apply under the FLSA, then you need to identify who are your salaried employees. Do they fall under one of these white collar exemption, or and work through this, maybe the duties test. And again, this wage and hour division of the Department of Labor, they really do have a really good website. It's very informative, and maybe there's a lot of resources there that can help you work through some of those issues. Now, you find out who your salaried people are, and then of course, what is their salary? If they don't meet this threshold, you start thinking about, do they work overtime? Do they work more than 40 hours a week? Is it regularly that they are working over 40 hours a week, or is it just an occasional part of their job? And so as you see, if you have people that are working overtime, or exempt employees that are working more than 40 hours a week and not meeting that threshold amount that Karen just spoke about, you need to start considering whether or not you need to maybe look into giving raises, changing your pay structure to where you're doing overtime pay instead of salaries. Do you need to reorganize your whole work week, adjust your wages, adjust your workload, or bringing in other people to help? But those are some kind of introductory questions to start thinking through some of these HR issues. So we'll go to this next slide and maybe try to work through some of these options, give you some good ideas to work with.
So here's some different strategies. I think the new overtime rule isn't meant to ruin your budget or ruin your day or ruin your year. If you prepare for it and if you really look at what you can do, I think that it'll give businesses opportunities to just do business maybe in a little different way. So here's just some suggestions and some ideas that might help you as you prepare for these changes. Again, I think, as Jason mentioned, the most important thing is to see if your employees are on that threshold. So do you determine if there's a zone of employees that maybe fall within that threshold of that close to 47, 476. So for example, if you have employees that are at 45,000, can you budget for next year just to jump them up to 48,000, so that way they're above that threshold? But keep in mind that you will have to do that on an ongoing, at least every 3 years. You'll have to make sure that they're at that new level coming up. Other different things with the job classifications, really it's a time to evaluate those job descriptions that are so important for your organization and really see what tasks they're doing. Is there something that can be eliminated? Is there something that's duplicated? Do you need to shift some of the work around so that you can make sure that your employees are working 40-hour work weeks if they will be affected by this? I'm not in any way suggesting that you give the salary person all the work to do in the office, but just be creative in how you can look at your workforce and your staff and see how you can redistribute some of the work. Maybe if you have employees that are working 60-hour work weeks, that's not healthy for the staff. So this might be an opportunity to look at that salary and look at your budget and see if maybe you can take some of the tasks and hire a part-time person to come in and help offset some of that work. So there's a lot of creative options that you have when you look at job classifications and you look at the lowering, what you need to do to make sure for your budget that it's not a huge impact on your budget. When you look at actual hours worked, as Jason mentioned, maybe you have employees that just occasionally work overtime, and that's okay, and just in your budget you can account for that. I do want to just give you a quick definition by the FLSA of what it means to have a work week. So if you have employees that are working 40 hours in a work week, if they work over 40 hours in that work week, then that's considered overtime. And a work week is defined as a period of 168 hours during 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. It begins on any day of the week at any hour of the day established by the employer. So you establish your work week, whether that be Monday through Sunday or Sunday through Saturday or Friday through Thursday, whatever that work week is, you as the employer establish that. And generally for purpose of minimum wage and overtime payments, each work week stands alone. So you can't, a work week is different than a pay period, so you might pay your employees every 2 weeks, but the work week is that set time that you've set aside or that you've defined as the work week for your employees. And so you need to make sure that your employees are only working, if they're subject to overtime, that they're only working 40 hours in that work week, or you're going to need to pay them the overtime. The other question that comes up a lot is, what does it mean for the hours worked? What exactly is that? And again, the FLSA standard, or their definition, is hours worked includes all time an employee must be on duty or an employer's premise, or on the employer's premises, or at any of the prescribed place of work. So if you have employees that go out to other locations when they're at that location, they're still working. It's also any additional time the employee is allowed to work. So it might be that you have flex time. Maybe you allow an employee to work from home. Maybe you allow them to check their email in the evening. All of that is considered work time, which leads us to that second piece of updating your policies and procedures. It's really important that you have a strong employee handbook, and in that handbook that you have policies around email usage, phone allocation, times to use your phone, an overtime approval process, and make sure that your employees know they can't just work unlimited amount of time if they're going to fall within this new guideline, that you have different approval processes for overtime, and that's been defined and set. If you offer flexible schedules, you want to make sure that that's outlined in some sort of a policy and that you have procedures for that as well. I think really it's just a change in how we're doing business, and please remember that you're not alone. This reaches into every industry, every organization. I think we'll be making some changes. Timekeeping is an important part. Again, that's part of what the FLSA regulates, is the record keeping part. So one question that's come up is, now that I have employees that'll be subject to overtime, do they have to start punching a clock? Do I have to go buy a time clock or an old school punch to have people punch in and out? And the answer is no, you don't need to do that. Really, the FLSA has a great fact sheet on their website about record keeping requirements. It's a great reference, but really you just need to make sure that if you allow flexibilities for your employees, if someone's subject to overtime and they're a non-exempt employee, you need to make sure that you know their total hours worked each day. So whether that be you keep it on an Excel spreadsheet or you have a timekeeping program, whatever that might be, you just want to make sure that you have that accurately represented as to what the hours are that an employee is working. And it's the total number of hours worked each day. So the offsetting benefits, it could be, there's a lot of different things around that. You'll see a lot of information out there. If you start searching, you'll find it. If you start looking at things, there's different suggestions of looking at how you can look at your employees today, their total base pay, and figure out if you have an employee who on average works 50 hours a week, do you need to lower that base pay to offset that anticipated overtime cost? I am not at all suggesting that everyone go out and lower employees' pays, but it's just something that you can look at when you're looking at your budget. You know, again, it might be that you need to hire a part-time employee to help offset some of that. So there's just different things you'll see with benefits. And then that brings me to probably the most important thing, in my opinion, is your employee communication. Your employees know this change is happening, probably. They're going to find out if they don't already. It's been in the news. I'm sure if they have a spouse in the workplace, it's just friends in the workplace, it'll become a hot topic over the summer and as it gets closer to that December 1st deadline. I think the key in rolling out these changes is that you communicate with your employees, and that you do these changes and you make these changes in a non-discriminatory way. So this isn't the time for you to target that staff member that you want out of your organization. It's really important that you do this across the board consistently with everybody and that you communicate. I'd recommend if you could create an FAQ for sending out information. If you have an open door policy, if you have staff meetings, start talking about this once you have the plan. Don't go out and say, well, we could be doing this or we could be doing that. Get your plan established, get prepared, find out what you need to do, and then start communicating it with your employees. You don't want this to affect morale, and people probably are starting to have fears in the workplace. Once this starts getting out there, there might be a fear of demotion, there's the fear of pay cuts, layoffs, and just the general anxiety of losing that exempt status. There's a lot of employees who worked really hard to become an exempt employee in their career, and now all of a sudden they're not. And it's really important that you communicate with that you communicate with those employees that it's not anything that they've done. It's just the changes in the regulation, and it's something that everyone's going through right now. So it's really important to keep that morale up and communicate and make sure that you have that plan in place.
Those are all very good points, Karen. And we try to, or you may want to try to take advantage of this time coming up until December 1st to, like she said, go over your policies, but also to look at your classifications. This is a very good time to make sure that you've classified your salaried, your exempt employees correctly. Unfortunately, the Department of Labor, they kind of have a initiative on misclassifications, and that's where a lot of employers get in trouble. I will say it's if you only have one exempt employee in your organization, they're probably not coming after you to see if you've classified this employee correctly. It's more on a enterprise-wide, organizational-wide area where they're looking to make sure that the employer has done all of their employees correctly, classified them. And so, you know, you as the employer do have the discretion to choose some of these tools to make sure that you meet all these standards. Explain to your employees that, you know, it's the federal government that is setting these standards. It's not us just coming up with new rules or the employer just making changes, but it's the employer trying to make sure that they meet these standards and make sure that that each of the employees are being compensated, you know, fairly, that they are getting paid overtime, that they're getting paid for the hours that they work. So in the end, it comes down to, is anybody working overtime? If all your employees are working under 40 hours, you're going to have an easy transition, because it's where if these thresholds, if your employees are working overtime and not making these threshold amount, that is when you're going to get in trouble. So if you're using your part-time employees or a temp worker to help redistribute the load, then you're not going to have any worries. It's just when you hit that overtime is when you need to start worrying. So
I think, and to also realize that the flexibility, you're not losing the flexibility. I know with nonprofits, a lot of times there's events that come up and there's different after-hours activities, and it'll take a little bit of creativity, I think, in the workplace to be able to offset some of that overtime cost. It might be that you just need to just put it in your budget for if you're having an event. Just know that's part of the cost of doing the event, is that you'll have that overtime cost. And just know that as you're looking at sponsors and as you're looking at the total cost of the event, that that's just part of what you'll have to do. Or you can get creative in your workplace and maybe if your event's on a Thursday night, maybe close the office on Friday, and that way you have that time. So I think that it's just, there's ways that you can be creative and know, or you'll just have to bite the bullet and just know that that's part of the cost of doing business as well. So another thing I just wanted to add was, as you're looking at job classifications and as you're looking at your employees, kind of their hours and whatnot, you know, you can see where, as a salaried employee, and I'm guilty of this, it might be that as a salaried employee, I'll stay, you know, 15 minutes, 30 minutes longer, but I might take a little bit of time to do, you know, some personal email or different things at work. And I think it's important just to make sure that your employees understand the importance of that when they're working, they need to be working and tracking those hours accurately. I think it's just a common thing in the workplace. We all have cell phones, we all have computers, and it's tempting to do things outside of those work hours or during the work hours to do personal things. So I think you know, it's just a change in the workplace, I think, for your employees as well. And just be aware of that too. I think as a leader in the organization, you can set a good example and be supportive of your employees and realize that it is a change, and it will affect everyone differently. There will be some people that will have a lot of anxiety and really feel like they're getting demoted because now all of a sudden they have to have a time card when they didn't before. So just keep that in mind. And My contact information's up there. Jason's contact information's up there. You're welcome to reach out to us. I'm happy to answer questions if I can. Yeah.
And go ahead and feel free to send us an email if you want a link to the Wage and Hour Division. That website is a very helpful website. And then also there's a packet that they put out for nonprofits, guidance for nonprofit organizations on paying overtime. We can send that along to you as well if you contact us. So we're ready for questions, Erin, if you want to. Well, hopefully we're ready for questions.
Yeah. We'll try and answer as many as we can.
And really quickly, before we turn it over for questions, this recording will be sent out to everyone on this list, everyone in attendance and those who also missed this presentation today. We'll include the contact information for Jason and Karen. We also will include some additional information, things that you guys can go research, places that you can find information. So we want to make sure that this is something that is not scary and that you aren't prepared for and you have all the information that you need. So with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over for questions. Again, if you'd like to type in your question, feel free to do that and I can read it. If you would like to just talk through your question, raise your hand electronically and I will unmute you. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Kathy Floyd. Kathy, you are unmuted.
Hi, I just raised my hand and asked if
Kathy, can you hear us? All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute you again, Kathy. All right, Jan Super, I'm going to unmute you for you to ask the question.
I have no question.
Okay, thanks so much. Are there any questions at all? We have just about 20 minutes that we can answer any questions that there may be. Okay, I do have a question. It says, are employees of nonprofits allowed to volunteer for special functions?
No. If you have an employee, they're an employee and they're not allowed to be volunteers because they're on your staff and on your payroll, and so they cannot volunteer their time back to the organization.
That's a really good question.
It's a great question, yeah. It's a common question. Thanks for asking that.
Okay, Kimberly, it looks like you have a question. I am going to unmute you. Kimberly, you are unmuted. Okay, I do have a couple other questions coming in. Should organizations get a legal review of their employee handbook with this change?
I think it's it's a great plan. It'd be a lot easier to pay a couple hours of a professional to look over your policies up front than having to pay a lot of back pay and liquidated damages should you have problems down the road. It really shouldn't take a lot of time if you find the right people to go over those policies to point out what is and what isn't on board in your policies and to give you some good guidance going forward.
Great. Another question. If you do not sell any products, does this apply to your organization?
It could. Say you have someone that, I guess it depends on your mission, your message that you're trying to put out there. If you're using the World Wide Web to put out your mission to to bring people in, I guess there is a possibility that you are working in the interstate commerce. So it's just not goods, not when you're just selling goods. It may be that you're just a nonprofit that gives hygiene products to the homeless and you get all those products from Missouri, that would mean that you're, another state. That means that you are in the interstate commerce. So it doesn't have to do with just selling goods. There's, like we said, credit card. If you're taking credit card donations, you have a chance. Although, just because you're taking donations, that won't count towards your threshold, but since you're using interstate commerce to do so, that could get you into trouble.
We have a question in the room.
So on that note, does that include things like if you use a fundraising platform that is based, say, in Washington, D.C. to collect those donations, or you have somebody that does your website hosting out of the state? Do those things count in that interstate commerce?
Well, since you have a contract with an out-of-state company, that's what's getting you in trouble. It's not that you're trying to get donations through those kind of websites or those services, but you're contracting with out-of-state companies, so you're in the interstate commerce thing.
All right, a few more questions coming in from online. What if the volunteer work is not related to their specific job duties? So again, I think this goes back to volunteering for an event.
It's a great question, but they're still an employee of the organization, and so any work that they do, even if it's outside of their job duties, any work that they do for the organization needs to be paid. It is work time. Great question.
Okay. Volunteering employees. I understood that my employees can volunteer as long as it's not for the same job they're currently performing. For instance, if my finance officer were to volunteer for a development event, or a shelter employee were to volunteer for an event, is that not correct?
If they are employed with the organization and doing any type of work, so if you have your finance director going to an event and they're ushering for an event, they're still on the site of an event for their employer, and they're working, then they need to be paid for that time. Do you have anything to add to that?
It's kind of one of those bright line tests. I think it's, that's kind of really the easiest way to say that, you have to be really careful. There may be circumstances where they can volunteer for you, but there's such an easy, I guess, an easy risk there that you are kind of forcing them to volunteer, that it's not, that they aren't volunteering voluntarily for another position, or not another position, but another kind of different job. But it does have to be, to get around it, it would have to be unrelated to the job that they do for your organization. But you have to be extremely careful using them as a volunteer. You can get in trouble really, really easily.
I think it's a really slippery slope because, you hear the term a lot, all hands on deck. And, in a nonprofit, everyone takes the garbage out and everyone does whatever they need. And so if you have an employee who is volunteering at an event, but in their mind it's, well, I kind of have to be there because all hands on deck and it's the expectation, then it becomes they need to be paid. So I think it becomes a really slippery slope if you have employees that are volunteering for different things.
All right, another question. If you have an employee carrying a phone after regular business hours, say over the weekend, do we have to pay them for all of those hours, or just the time that they are actually on the phone?
Just the time that they're on the phone. So that's kind of like when you have someone on call, like a hospital has somebody on call. It's just the time that they actually take calls or take emails. It's not the time that they would have to, that there may be the potential that they're going to take a call. You don't have to pay them for that time.
So how would you track that, I guess? Is it just an on your honor thing, or?
So that kind of goes back to what she's talking about your timekeeping training.
And as a manager, if you know an employee is responding to emails at 10 o'clock at night, for you to not acknowledge that and pay them for that time, you can't do that. As a manager, you need to make sure as the leader that you're tracking that and that you're encouraging employees not to work after hours if they're subject to overtime. I think that's the real key. Or again, just have that in your budget and just know that that's part of what you will be having as part of their pay, is that they will have so many hours of overtime, or they'll again have to leave early on Friday because they had a crisis on Wednesday night that they were working in the evening for. So it's just that flexibility and knowing that you might need to have some flexibility in your budget and in the work week.
And I'll just make a note here too, just because you do have a policy and it's written in a procedure book, that does not mean that you don't, like, say you have to get your supervisor's permission to work overtime. If they work that overtime without permission, you will still have to pay for that overtime, but you'll still, because of your policies, will be able to discipline that employee. But just be aware that as long as they're working any overtime, you have to pay for that overtime.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, we have another question. Generally speaking, an executive director is exempt because of their admin duties. So is that true?
That's a good question. I think the best way to say this is just because of a title doesn't mean that they meet the duties test. It goes back to those duty tests. If your executive director has at least 2 or more employees underneath them that they're directing, that's part of their job, then you are likely going to meet that duties test. But I think, what was it, the administrator, is that what they were?
Administrative duties. Yeah.
So the administrative duty, yes, there's a good chance that they do meet that because of the duties test on the administrative, that they are not doing like manual labor, and all their work is directly related to the management of the organization. Then yes, likely they will meet the duties test. But again, depending on your organization, what your organization does, how it operates, it could apply differently. So the duties test is very important.
And you still have the salary threshold.
Right.
That's the important thing, is that even if your salary doesn't meet that salary threshold of $47,476, even if you're classified as a manager or professional, you're subject to overtime.
Right. And if you're not working overtime, then you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
A follow-up for that question. What if the ED does both admin and direct duties?
So that there is the, off the top of my head, I don't know what the exemption is called, but, or actually that's on the, if they, depends on how much they're paid. If they're paid over the 134,000 threshold, then they can meet the duties test by either administrative or executive. But it's not a mixture of the test. It's either they meet one of the duties or they don't, unless they're the paid high, the 134 exemption. Then they can use parts of duties of all of those white collars, but otherwise they got to meet it directly.
There was a mention of the increases every 3 years. Is there a threshold for those? A percentage increase each year, or each 3 years, or dollar amount yet lined out?
There is.
There's where I think they have kind of an expectation what it will be by 2020.
It's 51 or 52,000. It's a. I don't have the exact number now.
So that will be in the link on the sent out. Okay, perfect. All right, Laura Wilder, it looks like you do have a question. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Laura, you are unmuted.
At what point, or is it a test on when someone needs to be an employee rather than a contractor, so that the contractor status isn't used to avoid all kinds of issues.
Let me just clarify that. So when basically you would be using a contractor status versus employee status, correct?
Yeah, it's really important when you're looking at all of
So
the changes that you take that into consideration, that the definition of an independent contractor versus employee has not changed. So you need to make sure that if you have, that's a whole nother topic that we can get into, that independent contractor versus employee. You can't take the work that your employees are doing and just give it to an independent contractor to get around the overtime usage. You'll need to make sure that you really look at that and are still following that, those regulations, those requirements.
Yeah.
Does that answer that question, Laura?
it does. Well, we just have a situation where I'm basically the only full-time person, but I'm an independent contractor, but it's a permanent position, and and maybe we need to look at our definition. And if you have a board that's reluctant to do that because they like being able to have an independent contractor so that they don't have to look at employment issues, I guess that's what I'm getting at.
That could open a whole other can of worms.
Is when is that not okay for them to continue doing that?
Just because you're called an independent contractor doesn't mean that solves all the issues. There's even more tests, it seems like, between the employer independent contractor issue, and so the first thing to look at is how is that contract written up, and go from there. But yeah, you could go into many issues there.
Do we have any additional questions? We have about 10 more minutes that we can utilize today if there are any additional questions. Okay, it doesn't seem like we have any additional questions. Do you have any last comments that you guys would like to say about this?
I do. Just thank you so much for giving us the time to come and share some information, and hopefully this has helped you. I just really caution everyone out there to not wait until November 1st to make these changes for December 1st, or November 28th to make the changes for December 1st. It'll be really helpful for you, your board, your staff, everyone involved, for you to start now looking at what you need to do and taking those first steps. So again, my contact information is up there. I've worked in human resources for 20 years and have a lot of experience, and I'm happy to help if you have any other questions. So thank you again for allowing me to kind of do that.
Yeah, thank you. And we thank the Idaho Nonprofit Center and hope that that this is a help get you started to have these conversations with your board. So
thank you both very much for coming. That was very informative. Learned a lot. All of you joining us, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come to this. We will be sending out the link and additional resources. If you do have questions about this, you're more than welcome to reach out to Jason or Karen, as they both mentioned. As well, you can reach out to any staff member at the Idaho Nonprofit Center, and if we can't answer that question, we'll figure out someone who can. So thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful Tuesday.